Hello and welcome to Salon Talks. It is my great privilege to welcome to our New York studio today the former Director of National Intelligence under the Obama administration, James Clapper. Welcome, Director Clapper.
Thanks for having me.
You are the author of a new memoir, I guess it's safe to call it that.
Right.
It's called Facts and Fears, Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. Now, your career, people will know you from your time under President Obama, and I believe before that, both Presidents Bush. Do I have that right? In various parts of the intelligence
lower
community.
down the food chain.
Lower
yes.
down, but you were Director of National Intelligence
Yes.
for quite a few years under six and a half years under President Obama. And before that, you were the head of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. You were an NSA officer for quite a number of years. You were an Air Force officer before that. So you've been in national service and national security for a very long time. Now we're in this unusual situation. I think you agree that it's unusual, where the President of the United States has called for the Justice Department to investigate itself effectively and to investigate one part of the intelligence community, the FBI. I believe you've expressed the view that this is both an unprecedented and a dangerous situation. Why do you feel that way?
Well, I'm a big believer in the traditional norms and standards of this country, one of which is an independent Department of Justice and an independent FBI. And I think it's very worrisome when the President injects himself in terms of directing investigation, particularly when it pertains to investigation on him. And I think this is, one of a number of assaults on some of our institutions that I find very bothersome.
Specifically from this president?
Yes.
Obviously, many of our viewers have seen you on CNN, where you have been relatively outspoken in your criticism of him. However, do you view the people who are in charge at the agencies that you have some familiarity with as, for example, Gina Haspel apparently just confirmed to CIA, Mike Rogers, who I think is now head of NSA.
Well, he was just relieved. Will soon be retiring from active duty.
Soon retiring.
Yeah. But his replacement's superb.
And Dan Coates, who's now the head of, who's now has your former job.
Right.
Do you view those people as competent professionals?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think, though, that all of them have perhaps an additional burden that wouldn't have traditionally happened to them because of the requirement for them to provide top cover for their organizations and the people in them to continue to do the mission of intelligence.
Meaning that they have to protect their people from political interference? Is that what you perceive?
That's one aspect, and to ensure that carry on the tradition of truth to power. Even if on occasion the power doesn't listen to the truth,
yes,
they need to make sure that that's what the workforce serves up.
Now, what you talked about here, and what you talked about on CNN, these assaults on the institutions of the country, there's a certain thread, to me anyway, of melancholy or wistfulness in this book, that you are concerned about the state of America and the future of America. Is that fair?
I think it is. And one of the concerns, thanks for the question because it's an important one, is just the erosion of the idea of truth, and if I can use the term, the knowability of truth. Mm-hmm. And I think increasingly, and the Russians, by the way, exploit this to a fairly well, of casting doubt on whether truth is knowable, and the whole business with having alternative facts. And I think the loss or the erosion of the notion of truth as a beacon, which has always been, I think, pivotal to this country, is a very serious concern. Certainly one I have, and I reflect that in the book.
Well, your business, the intelligence business, is, I guess, predicated on the assumption that there are facts that we can figure out and know. They may be difficult to find, they may not be pleasant, but right, they're there and we can find them, right?
Well, yes. Although there are times when you're operating with an incomplete set of facts.
Right.
And then it's up, traditionally in intelligence, is to make your best assessment based on the facts you have. But everything should be factually based. Now, sometimes you make mistakes about that, but that primary tenet of seeking truth to the best of your ability is what's important, and I worry about the erosion of that principle.
Well, you're right about that very specifically in the context of the Russia investigation. If I have my facts correct, as early as approximately May 2016, fairly early in the presidential election cycle, you expressed the view that there was evidence that the Russians had begun to attempt to interfere with the
right.
with the election campaign. Correct?
That's right.
And you write in the book that by the fall of that year, it was clear to you that there was an unprecedented, aggressive, multifaceted, these are words that you use, espionage attempt using all kinds of different methods, including some of the ones we know about, propaganda, social media, various, an influx of Russian money into advertising. We know about Facebook and various other venues. This is a question you probably can't answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How much more do you know than is in the book that you cannot talk about?
Well, the only thing I don't talk about in the book particularly are certain sources and methods, which is traditionally in intelligence is what you do, the crown jewels that you always try to protect. So
right.
the intelligence community assessment, for example, that we published in January 6th of 2017, as we briefed then President-elect Trump on in Trump Tower,
yes,
was based on, although we put out an unclassified version, based on some highly sensitive sources, methods, and techniques and tradecraft that obviously we don't want to expose. But the important thing was to get the results of it out. So what is not reflected in the book, obviously, is the underlying facts, the sources, methods, techniques, tradecraft, et cetera, that were used to derive that.
And now you have also said that while you were Director of National Intelligence, you didn't have any personal knowledge of FBI Director Comey's counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign. You did, so you didn't have any specific knowledge about that.
And the policy I followed, both with Director Mueller when he was director of the FBI before, and then again, and certainly with Jim Comey, is I left it to them to decide when, whether, and what to tell me about a counterintelligence investigation, particularly if it involved U.S. persons. We're very sensitive about that. And so unless in their judgment there was some reason I needed to know about counterintelligence investigations, which there were a lot of those where they would tell me about, or counter-terrorist investigations, I would normally be informed about those. But there is a important function that the FBI uniquely performs in that they are a bridge between the law enforcement and intelligence communities.
Sure.
They straddle both.
Police, they're cops and they're intelligence
their traditional
officers.
law enforcement mission, which was altered profoundly as a result of 9/11. And so they straddle both worlds, and that's a delicate mission to carry out, which I think they do with great distinction. And so that's the rule I followed with both directors. So in a formal sense, no, I didn't know about. I surmised there was one underway, but I was not formally briefed on one. And actually, when Director Comey testified before the House Intelligence Committee on the 20th of March of 17, it was actually then I knew,
Right.
But I wasn't particularly surprised.
So the specific allegations that I don't even know if they rise to the level of allegations, the suggestions that the president is now making, that there was a political motivation behind some of these investigations, I imagine you find that sort of ludicrous on the merits, but you cannot actually speak to that as a factual question, right?
Well, I mean, that's obviously his interpretation or his spin that this gets into the deep states business.
Yes.
From my perspective, what I was most concerned about, and still am, and one of the most motivations for writing the book was the profound threat that Russia poses. And this information operations campaign that they waged during the campaigns and since, and they will continue, because it's for them a very cost-effective way of undermining our very system, and that's what they're after.
In your opinion, do we still not quite know the scale and scope of their operation?
I think we have a reasonably good idea. A lot of that has emerged in the course of the Mueller investigation. No, I don't think we know everything. He and his team obviously know far more than what's out there.
Yeah.
Reflective of that is the indictment that was made public in February of the 13 Russians and the Internet Research Agency, which, from my standpoint, was very gratifying because it served as something of a bookend for our intelligence community assessment that we wrote pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In the space of about a month. And that served to validate our findings in that intelligence community assessment. So I suspect there's more of that out there that we haven't heard yet. And certainly when I left, I considered that we had kind of scratched the surface on a lot of these things, particularly the multifaceted and pervasive use of social media by the Russians. We understood that, I think, but not to the depth and detail that we've since learned.
Now, you have clearly endorsed the intelligence community's assessment that one of the goals of Russian interference was to aid Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. You have suggested, however, that perhaps that wasn't the primary concern.
Well,
their primary goal.
They had their goals evolved over time. Their first objective was simply to sow doubt, discord, discontent in this country, and I think they succeeded to it fairly well because we're a ripe target for that.
Yeah.
And secondly, because of starting with a strong personal animus that Putin has for the Clintons and specifically for Secretary Clinton, was to do everything they could to denigrate and marginalize her. And as I recount in the book, some striking parallels in terms of themes and things that the Trump campaign said and did, and the things that the Russians said and did. Not suggesting collusion, don't have any proof of that, but just striking parallelism. And thirdly, once Mr. Trump emerged as a serious contender, particularly when he became the Republican nominee, well, the Russians stood up and took notice because they didn't take him seriously initially either, like many people in this country. Well, then they did, and then they began to actively support him, principally because, well, he wasn't Hillary Clinton, but as a businessman, he'd been to Russia, and they thought they could deal with him, and importantly, that the Russians didn't think that he'd beat them up about human rights abuses. So they disfavored her and favored him almost by definition.
I can virtually guarantee that you're not going to give me a very specific answer to this question. Do you have personal views on how much of the now infamous Steele dossier is true and how much is not true?
Well, some of what was in the dossier, first of all, I need to make an important point here. First, we did not use the dossier as a source for the intelligence community assessment. That's point one. The dossier is not classified, not an intelligence document. It's actually a collection of 17 separate memos. Some of what was in the dossier was actually corroborated, but separately in our intelligence community assessment from other sources that we were confident in. The salacious parts, no, that's never been corroborated. It would appear to me that as time has gone on, more and more of it has been corroborated, but I can't actually give you a percentage. It's hard, but some of it was valid. And those memos were sort of analogous to something that we do in the intelligence community, or the intelligence community does, not me anymore, which is first instance reporting. And sometimes those reports are right on the money, and other times they're not. And the collection of memos in the dossier are sort of like that. But again, to stress, we did not draw on it. Our only purpose, at least my only purpose, for briefing the President-elect in the no good deed goes unpunished department was to let him know it was out there. And Jim Comey, the director of the FBI, was concerned about, the Russians, for them, this is an art and science to what they call compromat.
Yes.
Compromising material, whether it's actual, real, or contrived. And it doesn't matter, because if they can, they'll use that for leverage. And that's what Director Comey wanted to warn the President-elect about. And we tried to do it on a discrete basis as possible, so that's why at the end we necked down to just Director Comey and the President-elect.
This issue that you talked about earlier with facts, with the loss of a shared sense of facts and truth, where we get into almost these issues that could be considered philosophy, you know, Plato's cave or something. Right. Was this actually an issue that was important to the Russians? The idea of undermining the Americans' confidence in facts?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This is classic. It goes back to the Soviet era. And it's almost in their genes to do this. There's a fundamental resentment of the United States, starting with Vladimir Putin. He held Hillary Clinton responsible for prompting what he thought was another color revolution to overturn him. And so, you know, the Panama Papers, the doping scandal, all these revelations, he deeply resented those. And of course, the United States represents everything that Russia isn't. And you know, free and open media, independent judiciary. He's got history, although he never proved it, you know, for kind of disposing of political opponents in his country. So he's very much an autocrat. You need to remember he's a former KGB officer.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think
East Germany at one time, I believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he approaches, I think, in his dealings with anybody, particularly another foreign head of state, in the same way he would if he were a KGB officer. What can I do to leverage or influence or co-opt this person?
Right, right. So is that, I think it's potentially, I hope you agree with this, it's potentially dangerous to see too much continuity between the Soviet era and the current era in Russia, but is that an area where you see some continuity? Because under the Soviets, they very much took the position that truth is what we say it is. That was
yeah, exactly. Well, there was a period there where, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a change, and of course, from Putin's standpoint, a weakness. Putin characterized the demise of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and so. And I think, frankly, he is more of a throwback to the Tsar era than to the Soviet era. He has this vision of great Russia and a very expansive definition of who's a Russian. Anybody who speaks Russian, by definition, is a Russian citizen, that sort of thing. So he has this very expansive view, and which I think explains why, opportunistically, he saw a chance to recover the Crimea, which was a theft in his mind.
Sure. When
it was given away to Ukraine by Khrushchev. So he has this vision, and he sees in us everything that is antithetical to that vision.
Mm-hmm. Those of you watching have probably figured this out. Our guest today is James Clapper, the former director of National Intelligence and author of the new memoir, Facts and Fears: Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. Director Clapper, the specific allegation that I think President Trump is banking on, which strikes some people, and not entirely, not exclusively his supporters, as possibly believable, is the allegation that people in your world, in the intelligence community, could have had some degree of favoritism toward someone who is perceived as a political insider who knew the ropes and knew the language, such as Secretary Clinton, who's been involved in and around government for many years, former Secretary of State, versus an outsider from the business world who really didn't, and as we now know, does not know any of that stuff. Right. So that is on its surface not an absurd allegation, right?
On its surface, it's not. I mean, and people in the intelligence community are intelligent people. They're citizens of the country, so they have their own political views. Many of them vote, which is all fine. It's just, and the same is true in the military. But professionally, you're supposed to keep that separate, your own private political views. In fact, there's a law about it, the Hatch Act, about how engaged you can become in political activities, whether you're military or civilian, doesn't matter. So yes, people have views on that, and I think there is, going in, great respect for and reverence for the office of the presidency, and particularly in his role, in the president's, his or her role as commander-in-chief. So instinctively and institutionally, there is respect for that. And obviously people have their own preferences. There are people in the intelligence community who voted for and are supporters of Mr. Trump. But all of that needs to be, and I think generally has been, despite what he thinks, kept separate.
So you do not, from your long career in the intelligence community, you do not think that that is likely to have played a significant role in whatever happened?
I don't think so. The intelligence community was kind of a damn if you do, damn if you don't proposition here. And I've often thought if President Obama had not tasked us, the intelligence community, I believe 4 components of it, to do our intelligence community assessment, what might have happened, because if you think about it, that was sort of the catalyst for a sequence of events that are still unfolding. And I'm not sure on our own we would have done that, particularly as we're nearing the end, and I was, for my part, counting the days till I was done. But President Obama charged us to do that, and that too has been, some have alleged, was a political act. It was not. He just wanted all of the intelligence reporting put together in one place so that that could be handed off to the next administration and to the Congress. And that was his whole intent. And he also wanted us to publish an unclassified version, which we did. And the findings of that unclassified version were exactly the same wording as the highly classified version. It's just we couldn't, for obvious reasons, include the substantiating evidence. So no, I don't think it was a political act, but it became politicized, just the fact that we did it. And there were those on Capitol Hill who enjoined us and warned us that we, the Intelligence Committee, were being used as a tool by the administration in opposition to Mr. Trump, which was not the case. And again, our focus was on the adversary here, Russia, and what Russia was doing to try to undermine us.
It's been observed that we have this somewhat peculiar situation where, although you can't break this down strictly on partisan lines, many Democrats and self-described liberals have spoke up in defense of the intelligence community, people who maybe in the past have been critics of the intelligence community on many issues. I'm curious how you think the long history of controversy surrounding your profession has affected all this. You're well aware that you have an optics problem and a PR problem in the intelligence community. For some people, it might go back to, we could spend hours here debating what happened in Iran in 1953, what happened in Guatemala shortly after that, what happened in the Congo with the death of Patrice Lumumba, what happened in Chile in 1973. You're well aware of all these things. You've heard all these things. More recently, we had the weapons of mass destruction, intelligence failure in Iraq. We had the black sites and the enhanced interrogation programs that Ms. Haspel, Director Haspel, was apparently involved in. So how much has that history shaped a mistrust of your profession?
Well, I think it's had profound impact. I mean, and yes, history is replete with what people came to regard ex post facto as abuses. I was around during my war with Southeast Asia. I did 2 tours there, and so I went through all the Vietnam aftermath and the trauma that Vietnam caused this country, and the resultant the Church Pike hearings, which resulted in the establishment of the 2 oversight committees in 1976 and 1977.
Right, I was going to say the mid-'70s for our viewers.
So here, the crux of the issue, though, and what leads to this, at least in my mind, is unlike the Department of Agriculture, or the Department of Interior, or the Department of Commerce, which everything they do is largely transparent. It's open. Not so with the intelligence community, because the nature of what we do is secret. And if it were exposed, it'd be completely ineffective. We'd be compromised. So because of that and the aura of mystery that surrounds the intelligence community, there is a natural, almost instinctive, particularly in this country, concern, suspicion of deep, dark things, conspiratorial things going on that people don't know about. So one aspect of this is that this places a I think, an extra burden on the members who serve on those two committees in the House and the Senate.
The Intelligence Committee.
Because they have to act as surrogates for everyone else who cannot be exposed to what we do.
And I'm correct that they get a level of security clearance far above what other members of Congress receive.
Yes, they have access that other members of Congress don't. So they have to be the vanguard, the guards, the vigilantes, if you will. That may be a bad term, but to ensure that what the Intelligence Committee is doing is ethical, moral, and legal. Yeah, the Intelligence Committee has been asked to do not nice things by presidents who felt that there was a need for that. And then afterwards, sometimes we change our moral standards, and what was once okay now is not, and which is a kind of a professional risk or hazard that those who serve in the Intelligence Committee have. But I think there will always be this somewhat this aura of suspicion.
Right.
One of the things that I learned, and I recount this in the book, about the aftermath of Edward Snowden.
Yes.
I could almost understand what he did if his revelations were limited only to so-called domestic surveillance.
Right.
But he exposed so much else and compromised so much else that had absolutely nothing to do with so-called domestic intelligence, and compromised a lot of our capabilities. And if you're a taxpayer, you're going to be paying, we all are, to recover from the damage that he's caused.
Well, that's
the lesson,
yes, please,
one
please,
more thought here. The
please.
lesson here was, to me personally, because it was costly for me too, was the need for more transparency, and to try to declassify as much as we can, to give confidence as much as we can to the American public that this is not a rogue elephant, it's not out of control. There are rules and procedures for what we do, and we're oversighted by all three branches of the government. But I think for some it'll never satisfy the curiosity or the innate need to be assured that what we're doing is legal and appropriate. At the end of my 6.5 years, though, I will tell you, I recount this as well, I actually get very mixed signals from the American public about what it is they expect from their intelligence community and law enforcement. Whenever we have an untoward incident, you have the inevitable post-event critique. And I can think of many cases, Fort Hood shooting, Boston Marathon, two specific cases in point, where the post-event critique was the intelligence community or law enforcement should have been more intrusive. You should have been reading Major Hassan's emails more. You should have been surveilling those two brothers. And then other times, oh no, we are too intrusive. So as I say, mixed messages.
Do you feel that generally speaking, our system does create the correction where, however people may feel in retrospect about what happened in 1973 in Chile, to cite my earlier example, we know some of the facts. We know from later investigations that yes, U.S. foreign policy was involved, the CIA was involved, and we do know a lot more about what happened under the Bush administration after 9/11 because the Senate looked into it and issued a report that we got to read at least part of. Do you feel that those things, when the intelligence community executes a really controversial or perhaps counterproductive action, that we are going to hear about it?
Well, maybe, maybe not. I mean, we've learned a lot about the governance of covert action, which is foreign policy by clandestine means.
Yeah.
These are normally directed, approved by the president, and scrutinized very heavily and in great detail by the two oversight committees, because again, this is a case where, for obvious reasons, it has to remain classified. But in the end, the intelligence community is responding to policymakers, policymaker number one in this case, and have been put in a position of doing things that were then later regarded as inappropriate. And the use of so-called EITs by the CIA.
Enhanced interrogation techniques.
Enhanced interrogation techniques, to use the formal term of art. And people engaged in that believed they were doing what was appropriate and what was needed. It was approved by the president, sanctioned by the Department of Justice. And although you'll have a hard time finding anybody in the Congress today approved, in many cases, not just approved or acquiesced in, but encouraged.
That's fair.
In the Congress. So, and then retroactively, after the fact, we decide this is, with a higher moral standard, this is a bad thing to do. To me, this is not unlike after Pearl Harbor, when we relocated and interned Americans of Japanese descent. An egregious thing to do, was an injustice, but given the atmosphere at the time and the genuine fear and paranoia that existed after the Pearl Harbor attack, it's understandable if it's not excusable. A similar thing with EITs. I had returned to the intelligence community to head another agency, what's now National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I started there 2 days after 9/11.
Yeah.
I recall very distinctly the paranoia, the fear that we're going to have more attacks, and the pressure that was put on all the intelligence community. My mission was kind of distant from that, but especially CIA and FBI. And so I think it's important when we make these judgments with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight to try to remember the contemporaneous atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Let me, we should close. This has been a fascinating conversation, but on the topic of congressional oversight, and you knew I was going to go here, you brought up the subject of Edward Snowden. There might be that 1 or 2 minutes of your life that you wish you could have back when you were on Capitol Hill with Senator Wyden asking you about whether the NSA collected data on Americans, and you said not wittingly.
Well, what's never shown in the clip is the entire question that he asked.
Right.
And this was at the end of a 2.5-hour hearing on worldwide threat. And Senator Wyden asked the question rather euphemistically and used the word dossier, now famous for another reason,
Another
twice.
reason, yes.
And what that suggested to me was content, not telephone logs.
Right.
And what he was really asking about was the metadata storage program, limited metadata storage program that NSA had under the provisions of Section 215 of the Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act, yeah.
I didn't even think of that. I was not thinking about what he was asking about. I was thinking about another program, that which is governed by Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Amendments Act, as it's awkwardly called, which governs the collection of non-U.S. persons overseas. So my comment, and this whole exchange took less than a minute, my comment about it being inadvertent makes absolutely no sense in the context of Section 215, the metadata. It only makes sense in the context of Section 702. Moreover, I've been testifying 20 or 25 years on the Hill, maybe dozens of times, answered hundreds, maybe thousands of questions, and always endeavored to be truthful and straight about it. So just for a change of pace, I think I'll lie on this one question and do it on live television in front of one of my oversight committees who already knew the answer. Really? So I made a big mistake, which I've
in fairness,
acknowledged.
Yes, you acknowledged that after the fact.
I didn't lie. Big difference. And by the way, even if I had been on the same page with Senator Wyden when he asked the question, I'd have still been in a bad place because at the time the program was classified.
That's right. You were to some extent a victim of very bad timing, right? Because the Snowden revelations were very shortly after that, if I recollect
this
correctly.
was the actual exchange was in March, and then Snowden, he fled to China in June.
He says that watching you on television influenced his decision to do what he did. Do you believe that?
No, that's disingenuous at best, because he was purloining secrets 8 months before that exchange. So that's baloney.
Director James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence under President Obama and author of the new memoir, Facts and Fears, Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. Director Clapper, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.